Okay, I'm going to talk about active planning for the next 10 minutes. So active planning is really the application of what we call the mentalizing stance in the whole delivery of care, not just in the therapeutic moment in between a therapist and a young person. So let's really first just explore what we mean by the mentalizing stance. This is covered in more depth elsewhere in the manual, but very briefly. So you can get a mentalizing stance from a well-known furniture store. And there are four main aspects to it, and really the key to the mentalizing stance is making sure that all four of the legs are on the ground in a session. Generally speaking, I feel there's probably only about four things one can keep in mind during the anxiety-provoking setting that you find yourself in clinical situations. So the first is this notion of the inquisitive, curious, tentative stance, a kind of capacity to allow yourself to not know the answers, but to be really curious to find out and to model the fact that you are interested in mental states and what it's like to be the other person and getting it more accurately right in your mind. The second is holding multiple balances, balancing the notion of affect with the notion of cognitions and thoughts, balancing material that's happening here, now, in the moment, with whether there's episodes that have been happening in the past that are relevant. If you're working with a family, balancing the contributions of all members of the family, etc., etc. And then we terminate non-mentalizing interactions. It's quite an active way of working. When we recognize non-mentalizing as happening, and we particularly if we notice a pattern of it not happening, we don't allow it to continue. We intervene in ways to pause and rewind and try to understand how we shifted into a non-mentalizing way of interacting. And we'd use games and all kinds of activities to help us do that. And then finally, most importantly really, we're looking out constantly for any small examples of mentalizing, and we're highlighting these, positively reinforcing them, pointing out to the young person. I really liked the way you were just thinking just now. I mean, it seemed different from the way that you were thinking, maybe a couple of minutes before, when you seemed really certain and really kind of definite about things. And suddenly you kind of were putting your head on one side and the other side. And you really seem to be sort of thinking and kind of curious to find out what your mum is feeling and thinking at these times. I mean, did you notice a difference? That would be the kind of way that you'd address that. Okay, let's root active planning in something that's relatively real. This is an anonymised account, and one I hope that people would recognise in clinical work. So Jen is a 17-year-old. She's smoking cannabis all day, most days, and she's getting into minor offending, mainly stealing to pay for the cannabis that she's using. But she's had major family breakdowns recently, massive arguments, perhaps even the threat of violence or some actual violence. And she's begun what we'd call sofa surfing, moving from friend to friend, and perhaps at this stage just beginning to run out of friends and to become more vulnerable to exploitation, which many young people in that predicament find themselves. She's appearing irritable, a bit anxious, even mildly paranoid at times, and there's maybe mixed feelings in the professional networks that she could just be angry and streetwise, or perhaps even at worst this is the beginnings of an eruption of early psychotic illness. She's been referred to us by youth offending services, and after their initial assessment they're asking for us to help her in stopping cannabis, and they want to get her back into a college course. It was an arts course which she was doing quite well in until maybe a year ago. So these are the basic details, and obviously there's a lot more to know about her. But what I want to point out is that our understanding of mentalizing means that both the worker and Jen are, if you like, partially sighted. They both have a capacity to mentalize, but it's not something that comes 100% of the time. In fact, frequently it fails, particularly at times of stress. So the worker may have some ideas, and hopefully these are the kinds of ideas that we might recognise. I want to help. I want you to be safe from exploitation. And to start maybe thinking about your cannabis use, weighing up whether it's actually helping you as much as you say it is. And I want you to help me with you to identify your anxieties so that we can start to work on them. And I want to help your family to understand you better so that we can start to work, I guess, with the context that Jen is living in, that has perhaps contributed to the anxiety and other symptoms that we've heard of. Jen might see things rather differently. She may feel, look, you look rather dodgy to me. You're kind of coming at me like everybody else. You need to slow down. I want you to give me some space. Youth offending are just crowding me out too. My family, everybody's going on about them, everybody's trying to patch things up. They're not worth bothering with. I don't have any sense that they're helpful in my life. I need a place to live. I need a place to live away from them, where I can just maybe chill out with my friends a bit, with people I feel safe with, so that I can get rid of this numb, floaty feeling. And we might have some thoughts about that numb, floaty feeling. Perhaps this is an example of what we might call depersonalization, a common symptom in severe anxiety, but maybe also a harbinger of emerging psychosis. So this is what we're thinking, that the worker and client are both, if you like, partially sighted about each other and each other's minds and each other's intentions. And really, in a sense, this is what we're wanting to get at, that the task of any therapy, whether it's happening in a room, in regular sessions, or whether it's happening on a street-based level, taking the moment as we can, we start at the position of having, if you like, at best partially shared intentions that are implicit. They're not really happening in a way that we're aware of. We may have some overlap between our intentions and those of the young person, but we're not really openly able to kind of clarify and state those. And the process of coming into a more therapeutic relationship really implies kind of moving from that situation to a more explicit statement of intentions, and particularly hoping to open up a bit more area where there are shared, explicit intentions. And really, active planning is all about helping to open up that space where we have a greater shared area. So let's really focus on active planning a bit more. There's two main elements to active planning that we think about in AMBIT. The first is really about developing a team culture, a sense that this is a group of people who know who we are and how we behave in certain circumstances. And active planning is a very key part of that. So it's part of the AMBIT wheel, if you like. But what do we really mean by this? Well, the first is a sense that, time is a very precious commodity. And that we use that carefully, and that time that isn't planned out and doesn't have some kind of sense that I know what I'm trying to do in the next maybe even 5 minutes in marking the task when we think together, go and look at supervisory structures. Marking the task is very much about this, about how we use our time. But maybe it's going into a session and having some sense that I need a plan. I need to always have a map, some kind of plan about where I'm trying to get to. And that can go from 5 minutes to an hour's session, to what we're going to do over the next week or so, to what is our longer term care plan, that might stretch forward over the next few months or more. The next part of active planning is very much that we're broadcasting our intentions as workers. And that's really trying to take into account the fact that young people's ideas about why we're doing what we're doing may be very different from our own. And that really is the mentalizing stance, that we cannot assume that we are easy to read by the young people we're trying to work with, so that we take a purposeful stance about trying to explain why we are doing what we're doing or trying to do. And the final part, which I'm going to clarify a bit in later slides, is that planning fits really closely with this idea of mentalization. That it's about having a map that we're constantly ready to correct and improve the accuracy of. And mentalizing is about explaining behaviour in terms of what's going on in somebody's mind, but in explaining behaviour, it helps us adapt and think about, how future behaviour might be that would be addressing the dilemma in the present more effectively. So we'll cover that a little bit later. The second part of active planning, rather than just a general culture, is, if you like, a simple but we hope, reasonably subtle process, something that we actually can do. And there are two kind of main areas. One is that we do this comparison of our maps and our intended destinations, so that we can come to some shared agreement. We talk about waymarks and agreeing waymarks on the journey. And the other is about keeping it very simple, but in a way that we can look at where we see things being and broadcast where we think at the moment we might want to be starting to go, and then crucially comparing with what the young person makes of that and seeing if they want to go in that same direction. So planning fits with mentalizing. Let's have a look at this. Well, planning's about trying to set objectives and plans because that's how the evidence suggests we get effective change. That's why we set objectives and plans. But in common with holding the balance, part of that mentalizing stance that we covered earlier, there are things we're trying to balance. And one is this notion of broadcasting intentions. Why? Because we want to elicit support. We need the young person to understand why we're trying to do what we do. So in a sense, broadcasting intentions is about helping the client to mentalize me as a worker and not assuming that my intentions are that clear to a young person. And then we're about sustaining this kind of sensitive attunement. And if you like, this is about trying to strengthen the young person's relationship to help. And that means being helpful. One of the AMBIT principles of the stance is this notion of working in multiple domains, not just limiting the work that I do to the domain of the young person's thinking and feeling, their inner world, but also trying to work with their family to help their family see the notion of change. Also working perhaps with the school to help them get back into education. Also perhaps trying to help them get back into a football team, because that might be the thing that actually makes a difference and is meaningful to the young person. Now the point about this is that if any of these three sort of elements that we're trying to balance gets kind of too much emphasis over and above the others, things go wrong. If I'm just setting objectives and plans, I'm falling into this pre-mentalistic state, what we call teleology, quick fix thinking, that is really unhelpful to a young person if it's just a set of objectives and plans that they can't see the point of. Likewise, if I'm too overweighted to broadcast my intentions, I might forget that they are just that. They're just thoughts and ideas. I might fall into what we'd call psychic equivalence, where I believe that my thoughts are the way the world is, or become a bit pretend that, I'm kind of believing the clever words, but forgetting that there's no connection to what's going on for this young person. And likewise, sustaining sensitive attunement, being able to adapt my map and shift it and move the approach so that I'm doing something that genuinely feels useful to the young person, risks running into something that's a bit pretend, that I might be backing up rather unhelpful behaviours. So that any one of these elements, if it becomes unbalanced, is unhelpful. And planning is about holding this balance. The other thing we talked about in the process is agreeing key problems. Where are we? Where are the areas? Are we agreeing that we're in the same kind of place, that we see the same kinds of problems? And if we've come to some agreement about that, where I'm thinking might be the most sensible place to head, may be rather different from where the young person wants to head. And we talk about this idea of trying to compare our differences in a way that is mentalizing, that's curious, not knowing, really trying to understand why it might be that a young person wants to head, due south rather than a little bit west. And in particular, we're looking for maybe a waymark that, say on this map, where the number 79 is, that might be a place that, we don't want to go to the same end destination, but we might agree that if we ended up maybe somewhere around the number 9 on that map, that might be a beginning part to start at. So finally, just this idea about how do we broadcast our intentions and begin to develop these common ideas. And this is just really a back of an envelope tool, and we wouldn't assume that everyone would want to use this all the time, but in a sense we're trying to use this to model what we think. And the key bit about this tool is what you'd see written right at the bottom, where it says suggestion. Worker fills this in after an initial discussion and then asks the young person to help correct it. So we're really trying to develop this idea that we are showing, open sourcing, to use geeky language from computer programming, our thoughts, and inviting the young person to help us correct it and getting it a little bit better. So I've made some scribbles here that are just my first hopes at trying to capture in a few phrases what Jen might see as being some of her strengths that I've written in green and some of the vulnerabilities and challenges that I've written in red. Friends are quite supportive, but on the other hand, she's maybe beginning to see that they're the ones who are supplying her with the cannabis that she feels she might be using a bit too much of, that might be relating to this numb, anxious feeling, etc., etc. And I've put on the right, those of you some of you might remember a man called Maslow, who did a fantastic little tool called the hierarchy of needs. Well, this is really a very sort of simplified version of Maslow. At the bottom, what we think we might want to do now. Further up, what we might start wanting to think about doing next. And at the top, this notion of why, really getting at the intentions. What's the end aim? And it's at the intentions that we might begin to get a little bit of kind of common ground with Jen. Sometimes we can find that it's easier to agree on the distant aims than it is to agree on the immediate steps. And the point about this is that I might scribble out this and then show this to Jen, not in a sense that this is I know what I'm going to do, but this is my best guess. Help me get this more accurate, so that I can, genuinely do something that feels helpful. And where there are differences between Jen and I, that's where I might get curious. How did I get this so wrong in my mind? Or how did I just get such a different idea from you? Now, there's an exercise that people can do. I'm not going to describe in great detail how you might want to do that, perhaps in a team as an exercise. But it's a helpful way of just, practicing this with a partner who doesn't know one of your key cases. But I hope that gives just a flavour of the ideas of active planning. I said I was going to do it in 10 minutes. It's turned out to be 20 minutes, so profound apologies.